So good afternoon, everyone. I have the pleasure to welcome Mr. Max Shmookler to AUB and specifically to the Department of Arabic and Near Eastern Languages. I met Max exactly 1 year ago.
Really?
It's exactly, actually.
Exactly.
As I was a respondent for his paper on Maqamat Ahmed Faris al-Shudiaq at the Middle East Studies Association last year. Max is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies at Columbia University. His lecture today deals with the Maqamat genre, a topic that many of you know is dear to my heart. So what is Maqamat? Maqamat is a native genre of fictional Arabic prose literature that has played an important role in Middle Eastern and global literary history. Invented in Arabic in the 4th, 10th century in Eastern Iran, Maqamat are collections of picaresque tales that narrate the various adventures of a trickster's travels across cities of the medieval Islamic world. Casting the exploits and speech of its characters in flowery language, flowery prose, Maqamat tales are often ironic, parodic, and darkly humorous tales which have proven themselves remarkably clever at capturing the attention of medieval audiences, modern readers, and critics. They often mock our aspects of the society or our knowledge and perception of literature, religion, science, and philosophy. One of the most exciting features about this genre of works is its relatively continuous and widespread circulation over time and space. The Maqamat, in fact, is one of the longest lasting and widest traveling literary forms in the world. They form a written tradition and network of texts that can be traced across the works of different authors and manuscript traditions. From the Maqamat's first appearance in Eastern Iran at the end of the 10th century, the practice of Maqama writing spread to most regions of the Muslim world, including Iran, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, North Africa, Al-Andalus, Yemen, Northern India, and West Africa. Like the shape-shifting itinerant characters they portray, Maqamat works have exhibited a remarkable capacity to travel and transform. Works of the genre traversed linguistic, religious, and cultural boundaries, as writers composed Maqamat collections in Persian, Hebrew, Syriac, Ottoman Turkish, and Hausa. Moreover, some modern scholars have posited the influence of the Maqama form in the rise of the anti-heroes of the Spanish picaresque. Scholars of the modern Arabic novel have similarly argued for the important place of the Maqama as a model in the imagination of the first novelists writing in Arabic in the 19th century. So the 19th century, this brings me to Max's lecture for this afternoon. Max's interest in the Maqama began with a curiosity about Saja, rhymed prose, in a collection of Sudanese short stories he co-published this year with Comma Press. His dissertation is a study of 4 Maqama collections of the late 18th and early 19th century in Mount Lebanon. Beyond the importance of making these Maqamat texts, largely unknown texts available to scholars of literary history, Max hopes that his work will help expand our thinking about modern narrative forms beyond the novel and before the Nahda. Max's lecture for today is entitled Adab in its own terms, a study of the Maqamat of al-Turk. Please join me in welcoming Max to AUB. Max, I guess you have 50 minutes, 55 minutes, and then we'll leave the room for questions and answers.
Can we negotiate?
We can negotiate. Yes.
Great.
56 minutes.
Well, before, can you hear me? Let's start with, can you hear me? Wonderful. Great. How's that? Much better? So before anything else, let me thank Dr. Orfali and all of the wonderful people in the Department of Arabic and Near Eastern Languages for welcoming me and making me feel really, truly at home here. I'm deeply grateful for it. As well as the wonderful folks in the library, the archivists who have really gone above and beyond in helping me to trace and search out various texts and manuscripts. So I'm very grateful for that. It feels actually something like a gift, and as we know, and as I'll talk about, a gift implies an obligation to return. to pay it back. It's never really a free gift. So I've been thinking a little bit today about my talk as a form of compensation for Dr. Orfali's kindness in welcoming me and bringing me here to share this with you. The talk is called Adab in its own terms, but as Dr. Orfali may be getting used to by now, I've changed the subtitle. This happened also last year when we first met. The subtitle is now slightly more precise, Adab as agent. This is a major part of what I'll be arguing today, about thinking about Adab in its agentiveness, in its ability to act in the social world of the late 18th and early 19th century. And perhaps I'll be able to persuade some of you to adopt this way of thinking. Before the advent of literary journals and the reading public, prior to the adoption and adaptation of European narrative forms, such as the novel and the short story, and beyond the reductive Nahda-era discourse of modernity and tradition, what did adab mean to those who engaged in it? While I cannot answer this question in any comprehensive way, what I would like to do today is share some reflections on adab in the 11 Maqamat of Niqula al-Turk. For those who might not already be familiar with the Maqamat, and I apologize for repeating some of what Dr. Orfali just shared with you, it is a genre of Arabic narrative prose, or nathar, composed in the pleasing cadence of saja, or unmetered rhyme, and interspersed with passages of verse. The genre originated with Badi' al-Zaman al-Hamadani, as we just heard, in the late 10th century, and spread from the Abbasid hinterlands to the courts of the caliphs of Baghdad, and from there to the farthest reaches of the Islamic world. As the genre spread over the centuries, it attracted hundreds of authors, as Yaakov Hamin Antella has shown us, as well as many commentators and translators. As it spread, it also poached, as Michel de Certeau would say, styles and topoi from other genres of writing, from the hadith of the Prophet to the Bukhala of al-Jahiz, and from history and astronomy to medicine, food, and chess. Each maqama episode typically revolves around an encounter between a narrator, or rawi, and his clever, eloquent, and often duplicitous companion, the adib. The rawi not only relates each story, but serves as a witness, participant, and often an unwitting victim of his encounters with the adib. In al-Turk's Maqamat, the rawi is named al-Hazim, the resolute or firm or perhaps the stout-hearted. His double, the adib, is named Abu Nawadir, the father of anecdotes. As we will see, some aspects of these characters are common. They share much in common with the long history of the Maqama. Others, such as the sincerity of the adib, strike me as quite new. In the classical tradition, the adib is distinguished by his eloquence and his penchant for trickery and deception. He dons a variety of disguises and adopts numerous identities, from physician to imam to old woman, often employing his eloquence to swindle the narrator and his friends out of a few coins or deceive them in some other way. Some scholars refer to him as the adib muhtal, to recognize both his facility with adab and his love of trickery, or hil. The Moroccan literary scholar Abdul Fattah Khalito has called him a baligh, or ghator, drawing our attention not only to the character's felicity in rhetoric, or balagha, but also to the centrality of language as an object of both praise and deception in the Maqama. Today we are talking about a Maqama collection composed by an author on the cusp of modernity. So let me say a few words about Niqula al-Turk's biography and his place in history, before turning to a reading of his texts. His father, Yusuf al-Turk, was of Greek descent. He migrated from Istanbul to the town of Deir el-Qamar in Mount Lebanon, where Niqula was born in 1763. Although little is known about his early years, numerous scholars have noted that al-Turk's title, Mu'allim, suggests that he worked as a tutor for the children of some of the powerful families in Deir el-Qamar. We know he visited Egypt in September 1789 to establish connections with fellow members of the Melkite Greek Catholic Church. He was also apparently in Egypt, in Cairo in fact, in 1793, and may have remained there throughout the 1790s. Regardless, Bashir al-Shihabi al-Thani, the emir, enlisted him to observe the French observation during their occupation of Egypt from 1798 until 1801. His reports to the emir were the basis for a historical account of the French occupation, which begins with the death of the French monarch Louis XVI in 1793 and ends with the death of Napoleon in 1821. Al-Turk himself remained in Egypt until 1804, when he returned to Mount Lebanon. There he stayed, serving in the emir's court as a poet, scribe, and companion until his own death in 1828. The court in this period is a fascinating site for thinking about adab. In his study of the pioneers of the modern Nahda, Maroun Aboud argues that Emir Bashir, and here I'm quoting, revived Arabic adab in his age, motivated by his natural munificence and his ambitions to reinforce his emirate and heighten his reputation. This court, certainly, was crowded with poets, including Boutros Korama and subsequently Nasif al-Yazigi, as well as supplicants and a revolving host of notables and foreign dignitaries. But to identify this court as the site of a revival, as Aboud does, requires evidence that the poets themselves perceived a decline. And it seems to me that the men in Emir Bashir's court, at least in the first decades of the 19th century, were not concerned about the existential state of adab, nor, it seems, were they driven by the dual desire for progress and reform that came to mark adab and intellectual endeavors more generally from the middle of the 19th century moving forward. One further word on the poet and the emir. While much of what we know about the emir's court comes from his poets, Fawad al-Bustani notes one profound absence in Niqula al-Turk's diwan. According to al-Bustani, al-Turk never once mentions Jirjas Baz and the sons of Emir Yusuf, who were some of Emir Bashir's most powerful enemies in the 1790s and 1800s. To understand this absence and grasp the depth and complexity of the relationship between poet and patron here, it is vital to know that Yusuf al-Turk, Niqula's father, served Emir Yusuf al-Shihabi. Emir Yusuf ruled Mount Lebanon from 1770 until 1789, when he was replaced by Emir Bashir, his cousin, who ruled from 1789 until 1840, with a handful of interruptions. While Niqula al-Turk served Emir Bashir, his father remained loyal to Emir Yusuf, serving his three sons and their guardian, Jirjas Baz. The struggle over succession between the two Shihabi cousins, Yusuf and Bashir, was long and bloody. It only ended in 1807, when Bashir had Yusuf's sons blinded and executed Jirjas Baz and his main supporters. Among these supporters was Niqula al-Turk's father, Yusuf. Neither the man's advanced age nor his son's service to Emir Bashir were enough to save him, according to the historian Ahmed Haidar al-Shihabi. Yet, as Fawad al-Bustani writes, and again I'm quoting, this painful event did not prohibit the poet, that is, Niqula al-Turk, from fulfilling his duties in the court of the emir. As evidence, al-Bustani points to the substantial number of panegyrics dated to 1807 and the following years. Indeed, the absence of any mention of Jirjas Baz and the sons of Emir Yusuf is a striking testament to Niqula al-Turk's loyalty to, or perhaps his fear of, his patron. Reading his diwan, we can say that the father's death is only present in the son's virtual erasure of any trace of the rivalry that was responsible for it. Now that you have an idea of the genre, the author, and the environment in which he was writing, let me turn to the argument I wish to propose. As I hope to persuade you, these Maqamat are not only literary texts to be cataloged by genre and analyzed according to their formal features, nor are they solely a remarkable source, as Fawad al-Bustani believes, for the social and political history of early 19th century Mount Lebanon. Not just literary texts and historical sources, but also agents that played an active role in a world of social, economic, and political relationships. To think about adab as an agent, I will consider al-Turk's Maqamat as a form of currency, a tool of moral rebuke and censure, and a means to solidify friendship, as well, actually, as a collection of tax collectors. So we'll get to that in a minute. Shawkat Torawa has articulated this concept in his article, Defining Adab by Redefining the Adib. Torawa uses the example of the 9th century Adib, Ibn Abi Tahir Taifor, to expand our understanding of adab in a moment of significant social change, with the introduction of the technology of paper, the expansion of literacy, and the growth of what he calls a middle class in Baghdad. For Torawa, Ibn Abi Tahir represents the emergence of a new kind of adib, one who could make a living as a tutor, a teacher of writing and reading, a copyist, anthologist, poet, and storyteller. Working in these roles, Ibn Abi Tahir differed from the previous generation of prominent udaba, such as Al-Jahiz and Ibn Qutayba, both of whom were reliant on the patronage of caliphs. New professional opportunities, as Torawa points out, took place in new spaces, homes of patrons and fellow scholars, public and private libraries, bookstores in Baghdad's Suq al-Waraqin, and later madrasas. Torawa's approach is not just to provide a social historical context for a new type of literary figure. It is an attempt to think dialectically about the textual and the material worlds, as the German critic Walter Benjamin would say. In a 1934 address entitled The Author as Producer, Benjamin argued that the purported tension between a writer's political commitment to the class struggle and his dedication to the artistic integrity of his work can be resolved only when the problem is considered dialectically. To think dialectically is to think of the text and the world together, committing to their mutual irreducibility. Benjamin applies such an approach to literature, arguing that, quote, for the dialectical treatment of this problem, the rigid, isolated object, work, novel, book, and here we can add maqama, is of no use whatsoever. It must be inserted into the context of living social relations. For Benjamin, social relations were relations of production under the dual hegemony of industrial capitalism and fascism. For us, the question is how to insert the maqama into the context of living social relations. To do so, we might draw from contemporaneous historical accounts, such as Hananiya Munayir's account of the Shihabi emirs, entitled Ad-Dur al-Marsuf fi Tarikh al-Shuf, which I've playfully translated as the pearls arrayed in the Shuf's history displayed. But we have another quite interesting source. Each maqama has an introductory note. These notes include valuable information about when and why each episode was composed, its intended audience, and what effect, if any, it had in the world. It seems they were recorded by the scribes of the 6 manuscript copies upon which Fuad al-Bustani based his 1949 critical edition. And although I will not have the time to discuss them here, we should not forget Niqula al-Turk's own historical accounts, one of Napoleon, which has extended passages of Saja. In fact, at the very moments when the French and the Mamluks are battling, Niqula al-Turk turns to Saja to report on these events. And the other history of Ahmed Pasha al-Jazar, who for our purposes is the patron of the poet that we're studying, because he was the one who granted legitimacy to Bashir al-Shihabi II. Reading these sources alongside the Maqamat, I will reflect on 2 facets of the dialectic of text and world in an attempt to demonstrate their agency. The first such facet is economic. At least 3 of al-Turk's Maqamat were composed in order to redistribute wealth. The first 2 Maqamat, Adairiya and Al-Labnaniya, were composed for Emir Bashir, the first in 1804, the second at an unknown but presumably later date. they praise the emir in exchange for gifts. In one case, a plot of land and a house. In the other, a fur coat and provisions for winter. As al-Bustani reports, al-Turk's diwan is full of such requests. At various points, he composes poems requesting wheat, lentils, chickpeas, rice, cheese, oil, fat, arak, wine, tobacco, and snuff. He even asks for materials to fix a damaged roof. This invites consideration of adab as both a currency to be exchanged for material goods and as a market in which the value of that currency could be negotiated. Decades later, once the value of writing was standardized and its function narrowed by the spread of journals, newspapers, and publishers, the possibility of such negotiations became more limited, a point to which I would like to return later. While the Maqamat described above may serve as a site of economic negotiation, the fifth Maqama, al-Shamastariya, is better thought of as a tool for the enforcement of economic regulations. As I promised, a literary parallel to Amir Bashir's much reviled tax collectors. In al-Shamastariya, the narrator hears the Adib tell a story of meeting a man who planted magical seeds. These seeds grew into full stalks of wheat within half an hour. The Maqama was composed in 1806, we are told by the scribes, to compel the head of the village of Shamastar in Baalbek to pay a debt of 2 sacks of wheat to the emir. Its purpose, in other words, was to remind a recalcitrant notable of his duties in the socio-economic order of the Muqattaji system. When the brother of the notable in Shamastar received al-Turk's Maqama, he sent the emir the 2 sacks of wheat, thereby satisfying his brother's debt. Such debts, tied to notions of reputation and status, are not purely economic, but also clearly social. The social is the second and deeply intertwined facet of the dialectic between text and world that I wish to explore here. Consider the third Maqama, compiled from lines of poetry composed in the cold winter month of Kanun al-Awwal, or December, in 1811, and therefore entitled Al-Qanuniyya. The narrator, Al-Hazm, begins as follows, and this is number 1 in your handouts. Here's my translation. The moon of Kanun has appeared, and the time for concealment drawn near. The night is not yet in decline, and men toward their pillows recline. The gathering of brothers is sweet, as is the embrace of friends when they meet, enraptured with a love of late nights, to tear off the gown of boredom and plight. By the troubles of night I was gripped, for of friends and family I was stripped. I had been harmed by my migrations, and lacked companions and neighborly relations. Thinking about this passage as a depiction of social life, albeit one that contains both descriptive and aspirational aspects, we see quite clearly the value of sociality, as well as the suffering of the lonely narrator. As elsewhere in al-Turk's Maqamat, here loneliness is connected to place, or rather, to being out of place, insofar as a life of travel and migration has isolated the narrator from the pleasures of companionship and community. Yet this Maqama also links sociality to the cycle of the day and the year, in a divergence from the geographic focus of many Maqama collections. Here it is the temporal setting, a winter night, that heightens the loneliness of the wandering narrator. To relieve the burden of his loneliness, the narrator goes off in search of his old friend, Abu Nawadir. He finds him working as a poet in a fictional emir's balat, or court. Exactly like the author himself, Abu Nawadir's job is to praise the winners and mock the losers of their nightly card games. No bets are made, and no money is exchanged. Words and reputation are what is wagered. It should surprise no one, actually, that in the 10 poems, Amir Bashir is the winner of each and every single card game. Side note. These games are played, we are told by the scribes, to pass the long winter nights in amusement. Here again, it behooves us to think dialectically, a text that describes the loneliness of these winter nights also played a prominent role in combating that very loneliness. In this way, we can grasp the descriptive and agentive dimensions of adab together. The praise poems, composed and performed by al-Turk in the emir's court, and then placed in the mouth of Abu Nawadir, reflect the interpenetration of the social and the economic. 3 of the 10 poems in this maqama speak of the shame of losing as a dain, a debt that must be repaid. Here is the 3rd poem, number 2 in your packet, in my translation. Your losses are a heavy debt, so make good the money that you owe. Debt is a disgrace and shame, the best of men neither reap nor sow. Here, adab is clearly part of the circulation of debts and obligations that make a community, not merely a record or representation of that community. In other words, al-Qanuniyya is both a means to describe this community and the substitute currency that holds it together. The Maqama, however, was also a means to regulate social life by expressing dismay at the violation of norms and the disruption of the social order. Take the 6th Maqama, al-Qadiyya, for example, or for instance. It was written in 1807. This is the same year, incidentally, that Niqula, al-Turk's father, is executed. It is written in 1807 when al-Turk learned that some of the younger men in the emir's court had concocted a rumor that he had become semi-paralyzed in Fallujah. Hurt by this trick befitting a malicious adib, al-Turk composed al-Qadiyya in response. Before the news could spread, he recited his maqama upon the, quote, dirty ears of his erstwhile friends, who here and elsewhere he refers to as his sons. This maqama, as I will discuss in detail below, if I have the time, is a vehicle for the author to articulate 2 complementary processes, punishment and forgiveness. What we find is a homology between the cyclical nature of political alliances, as Osama Makdisi describes in the historical accounts of sovereignty in Mount Lebanon, and the process by which friendship comes into and is drawn out of crisis. As we already know from studies of the classical maqama, these texts are performative in the sense that they demonstrate the author's eloquence and erudition through the exchanges between his characters. But as these initial examples suggest, they are also performative in another sense. While at times these maqamat represent past and present realities, at others they influence and even dictate the behavior of the audience, reinforcing my sense that their literary or formal qualities cannot be studied in isolation. Reconstructing the function of adab within the social world is especially important given Niqula al-Turk's position in history. Much might be said about the analytical value of reading his works diachronically, that is, comparing the formal features of his 11 maqamat to the features of the canonical maqama collections of Badi' al-Zaman and his successors, most notably al-Hariri of Basra. But here, in addition to seeing al-Turk at the end of a long and distinguished literary history, we should recognize that he was writing decades before the Nahda, at least the Nahda as a self-conscious socio-political phenomenon of the mid to late 19th century. In this way, perhaps, his diwan lies beyond what the German philosopher Reinhard Koselleck calls a plane of historicity. For Koselleck, a plane of historicity is a shared set of understandings and experiences of temporality, not only including the past, but also the future. Such a conception is quite helpful for thinking about the notions of progress and reform, which are themselves claims about both the past and the future that distinguished the Nahda from the preceding period. The Maqama, in its own modest way, presents us with an opportunity to come to know aspects of the early 19th century in its own terms, rather than in the dismissive terms of later generations of intellectuals, including European philologists, who saw the Maqama as an exemplary manifestation of the cultural decline and intellectual stagnation of the pre-Nahda world. Thinking dialectically about Adab and the Adib can help us to reconstruct this pre-Nahda world. First of all, al-Turk was writing for an audience of patrons and peers for whom he frequently recited his work face to face, and whose reactions his words were carefully tailored to elicit. This audience is radically different from the reading public of the literary journals that spread in earnest in the 1860s and 1870s, even if, as Elizabeth Holt and others have observed, a given copy of a newspaper or a journal circulated among friends, co-workers, and family, and was frequently read aloud, an author such as Ahmed Faris al-Shidyak or Muhammad al-Muwaylahi was no longer composing for an immediate audience of associates and friends, but for an abstract, imagined audience of journal and newspaper readers in far-off places at future times. The audience is also a market for a work of adab. It both consumes and evaluates the work. Al-Turk's Maqamat were not commodities, or perhaps were not only commodities with a fixed value. On the contrary, many of them were designed to negotiate their own value by making demands on their audience, especially when that audience was a powerful and wealthy patron. Such an economic structure might be productively contrasted to the frequent reminders, requests, and pleas that the publisher Khalil al-Khoury included in the pages of Hadiqat al-Akhbar just a few decades later, as my colleague Ziad Dalal recently brought to my attention. Furthermore, the Maqama was not only a classical tradition in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, but a living genre in which a number of al-Turk's immediate predecessors, contemporaries, and successors wrote. It was not stagnant, decadent, or in decline. Consider, for instance, Murtada Zabidi, the author of the famous 18th century lexicon Taj al-Arus. He composed at least 9 maqamat in the last decades of the 18th century. One survives in manuscript form, composed but never delivered to the sheikh of the Hawara tribe in Upper Egypt, notably in gratitude for the latter's hospitality. Likewise, both Hassan al-Attar and his student, Rifa'a al-Tahtawi, composed maqamat. While one of al-Attar's maqamat was published, and Sabri Hafiz claims there are others in manuscript form, al-Tahtawi's maqamat were never committed to paper. Traces of them, however, can be found in his writings. In his famous travelogue, Takhlis al-Ibriz fi Talkhis Paris, he mentions that he composed a maqama extemporaneously, quote, while talking with some wits on his way from Alexandria to Marseille. Al-Tahtawi's offhand remark reminds us that the maqama was not only a written activity, but an oral one as well. And while traces of this oral archive are preserved in writing, much of it is lost to us. What was true for Egyptian udaba was also true for those from Mount Lebanon. In addition to Niqula al-Turk, my larger dissertation project will look at maqamat composed by Ahmed al-Barbir, Hanaya al-Munayr, and Nasif al-Yaziji. There are others too: Yusuf al-Hani al-Ghaziri, Ibrahim al-Ahdab, and lest he be forgotten for even a moment, Ahmed Faris al-Shidyak. Al-Shidyak was not only placed the maqama as the 13th chapter of each of the 4 volumes of his Asaq al-Asaq, but also published the strange and wonderful al-Maqama al-Bakhshishiyya in al-Jawa'ib. In my own preliminary archival research, I have begun to find other maqama texts from this period: a maqama by the Damascus Sheikh Najib al-Attar, another entitled al-Maqama al-Haditha by Raji al-Yaziji, the nephew or a nephew of Nasif, and most excitingly, I recently found what I believe to be a 7th manuscript copy of the Maqamat of Niqula al-Turk, miscatalogued in an archive here in Beirut under the name Abu Nawadir, an error I think both the author and his characters would have greatly appreciated. Reading Adab and Adib together we can see the ways in which the Maqama was embedded in economic and social life. Al-Turk composed Maqamat for material benefit, as well as to mark social events, express praise and condemnation, celebrate holidays, commemorate the visits of notables, embellish correspondence, entertain friends, and impress acquaintances, and express a range of feelings, from affection to disapproval, disappointment, and outrage. These were active, agentive roles for adab, roles which, perhaps, we can begin to see the Nahda as suppressing, even as its luminaries claim to be reforming and reviving the sphere of the literary. Embracing anthropologist Clifford Geertz's view that description is an interpretive act, let me now turn to a more detailed consideration of one or perhaps a few maqamat mentioned above, as a way to get at the meaning of adab as agent in its particularity. The first maqama, and depending on time, the only maqama I will discuss, is al-Maqama al-Dairiya, which in this 7th manuscript is actually called al-Maqama al-Qamariya. So when you put the two titles together, you suddenly have a very interesting location, being Dar al-Qamar, which we'll return to in a moment. This maqama was begun in April 1804, really just a few months after Niqula al-Turk returns from many years spent abroad in Egypt. It is the first episode in the print edition prepared by Fawad al-Bustani in 1949. It seems also to have been the first to be composed, given again that 1804 was the same year that al-Turk returned, blah, blah, blah. The narrative structure of this maqama is elaborate. Al-Hazm, our narrator, opens the maqama with a complaint that he has grown restless, malaltu, at home, and desires to travel, miltu ila safr. He praises the benefits of travel and warns against the dangers of staying at home, a theme that is both repeated and contradicted in al-Turk's other maqamat. Al-Hazm's own travels, condensed into a few lines, employ the long-established vocabulary of the rihla, including, for instance, his use of the verb atwi, recalling the opening line of the pre-Islamic poet al-Hutay'a's qasida of hardship while traveling in the barren desert, watawi thalathan, and so on. Al-Hazm, however, quickly leaves behind the generic imagery of towering mountains, Aud, and valleys, Wad, when he arrives at a place called Adab. He meanders through its fields and climbs over its rocky hills until he happens upon a crowd. Curious, he draws it closer. In the middle of the crowd is a man. Although the narrator does not recognize him yet, this is our Adib, Abu Nawadir. Al-Hazm encounters Abu Nawadir in the midst of a narrative act, and he tells us about it. That is, he not only relates Abu Nawadir's story, but he gives us important details about how it was told. Here is my translation, which is number 3 in your packet. I saw someone amidst the crowd telling a story sweet to hear aloud. He told the people of his dream, helping them see what it might mean. Already, we have a string of related verbs for narration, including yusradu and yakosu. Intrigued, the narrator stays to listen. He says, and this is number 4, so I listened to him as he related what appeared to him, the strange things in his sleep he had seen, and the mixed-up jumble of his dreams. In staging acts of speaking and listening, this passage illustrates what anthropologist Karen Barber calls reflexivity, the unique capacity of linguistic texts, as opposed to other forms of human expression, such as dance or painting, to both employ and comment upon the language that is their shared medium. Abu Nawadir's dream begins with him witnessing a terrifying scene. I put this as number 5, although I'll just be summarizing it rather than struggling to translate in rhyming prose the Arabic here. This is what he sees. The hills tremble, the mountains convulse, violent winds and a great gale are whipped up, lightning crowds the sky and thunder grows louder and louder. The rivers overflow and the seas crash. This is the naturalistic imagery of the apocalypse, of the end of days, as Abu Nawadir himself hastens to say, فَنَامَتَ السَّلَامَ وَقَامَتَ الْقِيَامَةِ, or in my slightly playful translation, and peace began to doze while the resurrection rose. The dreamer finds himself suspended above the peaks and waves of a roiling sea, and the quick cadence of the saj'a in these lines mirrors the rapidity of the unfolding events. As elsewhere in his diwan, al-Turk is not content to leave his characters' feelings implicit. In nearly every scene, he dedicates a line or two to explicitly articulating the character's affective state. Here, Abu Nawadir tells his audience that, quote, "The bonds of hope dissolved, and of my fate I grew resolved." For those interested in the history of emotion and its relationship to different conceptions of the self and formations of subjectivity, the Maqamat offers intriguing possibilities. One might ask what facets of psychological internality the rawi, or narrator, of the Maqamat and the subjects of an ostensibly modern novel share. But I digress. At this point, our narrator describes himself as adim al-najwa, or bereft of salvation. It is then that a shooting star, a shihab, breaks across the sky and stretches over the waves. The waters calm, the tempest settles, and al-Uqab, a name for the constellation of Aquila, swoops down and carries the dreamer to the heavens. Saved from certain death, the Adib's shock and confusion begin to abate. He spies a light, perhaps a star, in the image of a lion, guiding the heavens and illuminating the sunrise. "Who is this?" asks the dreaming Abu Nawadir. He is told, in the passive voice, Kila, that this is Shihab al-Afaq, the star of the horizons. This Shihab, another transparent allusion to his patron, Bashir al-Shihabi, is surrounded by brilliant stars and grips a deadly sword. After the anonymous voice details the awesome powers of this figure, Abu Nawadir decides to approach him and ask for assistance, all still within the narrative frame of the dream, to which our narrator is listening in the streets of Dar al-Qamar, and which our author is reciting for Amir Bashir himself. What the dreaming Abu Nawadir requests is a ma'wa. Here this term means both sanctuary or safe refuge and an actual house. Appealing to the Amir, Abu Nawadir does not conceal his desperation, but says, and this is number 6, I believe, أنا رهين القضاء وليس لي مأوى سوى الفضاء. I am subject to destiny, without refuge save the vastness before me. This represents a reversal of the traditional Adib's deceitful appeal for help. Here, as elsewhere in al-Turk's Maqamat, the Adib is strikingly sincere. Although he has not wholly surrendered his trickery, as we will see momentarily, he never once tricks the Amir. His concerns and his feelings are frequently expressed in the tone of jid, or sincerity, rather than hazal, or jest. We should also recall here that the author, Niqula al-Turk, had just returned from many years not only living abroad, but observing the French occupation of Egypt. The idea of sanctuary and refuge may have been profoundly appealing to him. Once Abu Nawadir has made his request, the Amir responds immediately. We are told that the Amir takes a board, lawh, and writes upon it in the most eloquent of styles. What he writes is a contract, or perhaps a promise, reminding us of the frequent mention of writing and correspondence in Hananiya Munayir's History of the Shihabi Amirs, Adur al-Marsuf fi Tariq al-Shuf. Pacts are written, as are oaths, to ensure compliance. Here, too, writing serves as a contract and a guarantee that stretches from the dream world to the realm of literary fiction to the material world. The contract reads, and this is number 7, I hereby grant you a place among the moon's stations, from which you can exalt over all the nations. I draw you close to the sky's dome, and entrust you with the finest home. I bequeath to you the best manor for those of the highest honor, and I will instruct the stars to gather round you in the heights where you are. That last one's a stretch, sorry. Hearing, rather than reading the Emir's promise, hearing, or rather reading the Emir's promise, Abu Nuwaydir takes a moment to absorb it and grasp its meaning, shaken with an intensity of emotion, tarab, and astonishment, ajab. Here the dream ends, but Abu Nuwaydir's story continues. He tells Al-Hazm and the assembled crowd that when he woke, he sprung from bed and began, much like Al-Hazm himself, to travel the country looking for someone to interpret his dream. He hears of a learned man who has studied the Tafsir al-Ahlam of Ibn Sirin, promised a hidden gem, or Jawhara Maknuna, by the now wide-awake and deceitful Abu Nuwaydir. The scholar agrees to the task of interpretation. The interpretation breaks the dream into its component narrative parts and offers a symbolic rendering of each. The convulsing earth and violent winds are taken as a sign, dalil, of Abu Nuwaydir's internal state of turmoil, mabika min al-belwa. And here belwa and metwa rhyme more than once in this maqama. The brilliant light that Abu Nuwaydir encountered in the sky is explained as the great Amir, Bashir as-Salam wa Shihab al-Anam, the harbinger of peace, star of the human race. The interpreter sees the Amir's gifts as a sign of his intent to protect Abu Nuwaydir in his realm, now explicitly named as Dar al-Qamar, and to grant him a plot of land and build for him a great house. Having finished his interpretation, the interpreter asks for his promised reward, but Abu Nuwaydir slyly confesses that he has no money. In place of coins, he offers a few verses of praise. The mamduh, or the one being praised, is not at all happy with this arrangement, and Abu Nuwaydir leaves him, quote, rolling over the ashes of this ill deed. In discussing the card games portrayed in Al-Kanuniya above, I mentioned that Amir Bashir had insisted that praise and mockery serve as the currency upon which bets were made. Yet here, in a different social space, the value of Abu Nuwaydir's praise is not recognized. In the final scene, the narration returns to our narrator, Al-Hazm. He is still in Dar al-Qamar, and as the crowd dissipates from around the Adab, Al-Hazm recognizes him as Abu Nuwaydir. Abu Nuwaydir tells Al-Hazm about his good fortune and then invites him to see his beautiful new home. The key to understanding this text dialectically, I would like to suggest, is a short note presumably written by the scribe and included in Fawad al-Bustani's 1949 edition. He footnotes, this being Bustani, he footnotes hundreds of elisions and additions between the 6 different witnesses, while here he makes no note, suggesting that all 6 manuscripts bear the same introductory text. In my very preliminary consultation of 2 of the manuscripts held at AUB, this inference seems correct. The note here reads, "It was said that the reason for the composition of this maqama was that the author requested a house from His Majesty the Emir, and when he presented his composition, he received what he wished for due to the Emir's nobility of character, makarim. He was given land and built on it a home in which to reside." Similar introductory notes precede each of the 11 maqamat, offering detailed information about the reasons for their composition, the intended audience of a given text, and what effect, if any, the text had upon its reception. Assuming, along with Maroun Aboud, that the note is an accurate portrayal of the Emir's reaction, what might we say about this particular work of Adab? First, it is not only a literary text, but an economic commodity, albeit one whose value is not pre-established. The anthropologist Marcel Mauss, who I mentioned earlier, would call such a commodity a gift, one that, quote, obliges a person to reciprocate the present that he has received. This obligation is masked, Mauss observes, by a, quote, polite fiction, formalism, and social deceit, perhaps offering us an explanation for the elaborate frame narratives and the polite distance created between the poet's request and his amir. Second, there is a particular mirroring that takes place here between the text and the world. On the one hand, it is composed and performed before the patron. On the other, both patron and author are characters in the narrative, where they enact the Turk's request and the desired response of the emir. To enjoy the reputation for generosity, therefore, the emir must act as prescribed by the text. The real emir, in other words, must live up to the poet's fiction. In this way, the fiction becomes a reality, and the maqama, like other panegyrics, is not merely representing the world around it, but dictating the audience's actions. By inserting a fictional emir into the narrative, al-Turk wrote his own patron into a prestigious literary tradition. In placing the Maqamat into a local geography, he also wrote the towns, villages, and regions of Mount Lebanon into that tradition. Not only Dar al-Qamar and Shamastar, but al-Mukhtara in the Shuf, Azawq and Kisrawan, Maghriya, Akka, and Saida. Notably, not Beirut. This practice of inscribing the patron and his realm into the maqama, or any other form of adab for that matter, confers a significant degree of legitimacy on the ruler. That is, beyond the fact that these maqamat explicitly praise the emir's generosity, they also implicitly elevate his status by writing him into the Arabic literary heritage, al-Turath al-Arabi. This heritage, of course, is not only a past, but also a future, one that would preserve the emir's generosity for future generations, including our own. The gesture, I should add, was mutual. Amir Bashir had some lines of Niqula al-Turk's poetry inscribed, quite literally, into the stone entranceway of one of the chambers of his palace, the Beit ad-Din.
Thank you, Max, for this wonderful talk, for questioning many of the things that we take actually for granted in our field, right? The role of the Nahda, the revival, the so-called the revival of the Maqama form, right, with the Yazji, the role of Adab in the 18th century, the so-called Asr al-Inhitat, right, the age of decline. The state even of our field, you've questioned that, where most of the literature of this century is still lying in manuscripts, as I see. Right, so how can we claim that we actually know what's happening in the 18th century, or even to describe it as an hitat, right? And I hope my students, my graduate students here are listening to this, and it's an invitation to them to actually work on these centuries. And I'm sure there are many questions from the audience, and some from myself. I'm expecting a question from Dr. Isa about translation, from Dr. Witt about Nahda, from Dr. Albaki about Ibn Manzoor, from Dr. Auji about Shidya, from Dr. Bahmardi about Yazji and Hamadani. So the floor is open to questions.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you so much for really interesting, very formal work that you've done. Beautiful, elegant. I really appreciated this. I have a couple of questions. Let me see. He threw it at me. So, in translation, I wanted actually to ask you about language and the use of Maqamat to teach Arabic, especially with the Sassi and the relationship with Nasif al-Yazji. If you could say something about perhaps a reduction of the Maqamat to the medieval Maqamas that takes place in this, because of the Orientalist interest in Hamadani and Hariri, and also about the global circulation, specifically of those two texts of the Maqamas, and what that tells about, because I would assume these are texts that differ very greatly from the medieval Maqamas in the sense that they're not global texts. These are very, correct me if I'm wrong, So if they are not global texts, how do they relate to the fact that this is a hyper-circulation of the Maqama of the medieval? He's a bit earlier, but I would assume as well that Daniel Hadid were being circulated also to teach children to read and write.
More questions?
I had actually the exact same question. In a sense, we know how Hamazani circulated, more or less, and we know from Matthew Keegan's also dissertation how the readers of Hariri, who read Hariri, so it's also the circulation of these texts. Who read these texts? If we know any information about this.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and it has different facets in thinking about how to answer it. It's funny you mentioned Disasi and this idea of teaching Arabic through the Maqama, because I had a line in there about Mu'tada Zabidi and how he would repay the gift of hospitality by teaching people at various places, especially in Egypt, it seems, by teaching them al-Hariri, which is to say that al-Hariri, knowledge of him and the pleasure of listening to him, was part of this market of exchange, embedded in this social world, 4 decades before Niqula Turk is writing, or really even if you think about 1804 and Zabidi dying in 1790, it's a matter of 20-year difference there. And Zabidi might arguably be much more of a global figure than some of these Maqama authors, Ahmed al-Barbir, Hanaya al-Munayr, folks whose texts are still in manuscript form. And so the philological translation of your dichotomy between the global circulation and the local circulation, it's articulated in the materiality of the texts. Only to say, there are some that are sitting in archives gathering dust, and there are others that have traveled around the world. I'm not sure, and this is a genuine question on my part, what the status of al-Hamadani was in the early 19th century. We know that Ibrahim al-Adab becomes very interested in his Rasail and publishes them, I think, in 1880, perhaps 1890. There's 2 editions of al-Hamadani's work that come out in the 1880s and 1890s, the first with al-Jawa'ib Press, and the second Muhammad Abdu's edition, which he edits while he's in Lebanon. So there's a resurgence of al-Hamadani. I'm not sure if he was even competing with al-Hariri in the time period that I'm thinking about. Another thing to say is that using so Niqula Turk is a mu'allim, and Butcher's Karama as well. These are people whose livelihoods in part are based on practices of teaching. I just don't know if they were using their own maqamat for that purpose. I have a sense for 6 or 7 other purposes that these maqamat serve. Embellish, like I mentioned, embellishing correspondence, the seeking of the material goods, the articulation of emotional concerns and social concerns. And I would place teaching among those. In fact, I have 2 more examples, and Maqam al-Kisrawaniya, which portrays the Adib as absolutely miserable. Why? Because he was robbed on the road coming back from Cairo to Mount Lebanon, and he's forced to take up the unenviable job of teaching Nahu wa Sarf and al-Ma'ani wal Bayan in a little village. So there's something there about the status of the teacher. This is also a maqama that's written from a friend to another friend, from Niqula Turk to one of the other men in the diwan. And it has a very different tone, much more playful, much also more scatological, more bodily, more animalistic. It's actually too bad we didn't get to it. I'll have to come back to Beirut, I guess, and share it with you.
In a sense, he's close to Hamadani here, right?
Much closer.
Lamenting the state of the Adib. He's a beggar.
Much closer. Although his own state was not so. He was not out there chopping firewood. He was well compensated for his labors.
Dr. Balbaki.
Just a quick comment. There's no doubt that the Maqamat were indeed used to teach Arabic, but only one aspect of Arabic, or a major aspect of Arabic, which is vocabulary.
Okay.
They're totally useless to teach syntax. Because of the sajja, the writer commits all sorts of changes which are not typical of Arabic. So with the absence of this dimension here in what we call modern Maqamats, this aspect is totally absent. So I wonder how could they have been used. They have been used for teaching students. Maybe, definitely not sarf nahu, perhaps bayan, balagha, ma'ani, but not vocabulary, which is antithetical to the medieval maqamats. That's the comment before. Thank you.
Actually, it's perfect. On these 2 points, I don't know if you know, but in the Decade Egyptien, which the French published, the only local or sort of Ottoman figure is actually Niqula, al-Turk. He has an ode to Napoleon.
Yes, he does.
And it is translated in order to teach the French also vocabulary. The French do. La Decade Egyptien, it's their first one, and it works perfectly because the subtitle of that piece is like a literary journal and one of political economy. So along with your thesis about agency. But my question then is, to what extent is al-Turk using the French in a similar sort of way within his poetry? I don't know if you follow that at all, but for personal gain, for example, because he seems to be working not only for Amir Bashir, but also sort of cozying up to Napoleon while he's in Egypt.
It's a fantastic question. He's certainly not a proponent of the Mamluks. He takes great pleasure in their defeat and takes great care in recording why. Due to their own incompetence and excesses, they've been defeated by the, in his view, obviously superior French. And so in tone, he's very different than al-Jabarti. Although he's much closer to Hassan al-Attar, also a Maqama writer, writing a Maqama that glorifies French knowledge and the hospitality of the French. The short answer to your question, as far as my limited knowledge goes, is that the economy of gift exchange was quite broad. That in Al-Munayir's account of this period, the 1790s and the 1800s, there are many, many people caught in the circulation of gifts. I do not know specifically if Niqula al-Turk was compensated for writing his praise poems of Napoleon.
Maybe the printing itself was a form of compensation.
I could imagine. And also his other works were published in French. They were translated and published in French in the 1830s. I guess the first part of his History of Napoleon was translated before his death, the second part afterwards. There was one other thing I was going to say, but now I've forgotten. It'll come back to me. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed your talk. I was wondering whether I wanted to push you a little bit on the agency part and.
It's okay. I can hear you.
You can hear me?
Oh, yeah.
I think part of it may be related to recording matters, but it doesn't. Whether you think of, I mean, you expressed you articulate.
Wow. Hello.
Welcome to Beirut. You articulated a notion of agency that was very connected to, that was almost utilitarian, and certainly voluntary or conscious, purposeful. And so I was wondering whether that kind of completes what you're looking to work through, or whether there's a dimension, and I thought of it also in relation to Koselleck, obviously, that's non-agent or that's non-conscious or non-voluntary, that's defined by, and that creates Adab as a mobilizer of non-conscious, non-voluntary necessarily, and but and yet agentive in a certain way, social relations or horizons of expectation and space of experience and the like, as opposed to this is my goal, you know, me and Niqula al-Turk, I want to obtain 2 sacks of grain from the multazim or whatever it is. But a kind of slightly more textured notion of agency, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe there wasn't a question in there either. So I'm not sure
No,
if I'm expecting, you know, but just whether agency, yeah,
I paused
just
for-
more a little bit about agency.
I paused for a moment, in part because I like pausing, but also because I was trying to decide if I wanted to tell you a story in an attempt to answer your question, and also to make up for the fact that I didn't finish reading my paper, which may have persuaded you that the agency here is very much coming from the intentionality of the poet and the specific social circumstances of his world, as opposed to larger structures. And let's suspend that for a moment. The story is, and I had mentioned it briefly, is that, and it's not clear actually if this is an apocryphal story or a true story, Niqula al-Turk either did or was alleged to have become paralyzed. This paralysis was half of his body in Fallaja, and in Bakama lisanuhu, his tongue became paralyzed as well. He was unable to speak. Al-Maqamat al-Qadiyah was written the same day, according to the scribes, that he learned that some of his sons, these younger men in the diwan, were circulating this rumor about him. It was written feverishly, and then it was given to a messenger to take to these boys and read to them as a reproach. So this is not an economic matter. He's not seeking remuneration. He doesn't want his house, his roof fixed, or an extra bag of grain or wheat. What he wants is to tell these boys, you can't act like this. This is unacceptable. And so the Maqama features the Rawi. He's lonely, as usual. He leaves his home. He goes to have an entertaining time listening to some judges discussing cases. As soon as he sits down with the judges, who bursts in but Abu Nawadir, in this case articulating very much what Niqula al-Turk is complaining of. He bursts in saying, a bunch of boys have been spreading a rumor that I became paralyzed. What are you going to do about it, Judge? Can you help me? The judge says, well, bring them here. There's an exchange of words. There's some anger. And the judge has the 3 boys thrown in jail. One of them is tortured. It's not a pleasant scene. And at the end of that, Abu Nawadir says, okay, I think I feel the return of mercy and my fatherly instincts. Perhaps you could now let them go. And so I had mentioned that this Maqama stages acts of punishment and forgiveness. And the Maqama ends with the father around his metaphorical sons walking away, having once again failed to pay the judge what the judge feels he's owed. However, that's not the point. The point is, this is a social intervention constructed in a very particular social historical moment where the Maqama is being used to rebuke people very much in his world. And so for me, analytically, that aspect of agency, that aspect of intention seems so clear. And the larger macro forces, they fade. Not to say that they're not obviously playing major roles. There's work to be done taking Munayir's account and Ahmed Haidar al-Shihabi's account and placing their writings about the changing values of wheat, practices of import and export, changing economics, the sanctions placed on various cities, all of these macroeconomic factors together with the really fine-grained stuff that we're finding in these maqamas. But perhaps that doesn't answer your question. Thumbs up, that's good.
What I find striking about Niqula al-Turk is that the beginning of the genre is forgotten, right? He doesn't seem to be, he looked at them as a collection, obviously, right? Because they're different villages, so he perceived this as a collection of maqamat. And Maqamat usually are written in collections, but he did not see himself as an emulator to Hamadani or Hariri, like the beginning of the genre, right? Hariri was very conscious about imitating Hamadani. He mentions that, and several others, Ibn Naqya, the others. Right? So Niqula al-Turk was simply writing within the genre, right? This is my impression. Now, what happened in the 19th century, right? Because again, we find with the Shidyaq, for example, or with the Yazji, that the beginning of the genre, they're very conscious about it.
Huge.
Even Isa ibn Hisham, right? Al-Haris bin Hitham, or they even imitate the narrator or something.
Absolutely.
Like that. And they're connected to this. There are two impressions that I've been hearing ever since I came back to Beirut from the US in the last 5-6 years. Is that, and I started working on the Maqamat, right? I wasn't doing that before. Is that Yazji revived the genre, right? Not that he was writing within the genre. The second is that these 19th century authors were reviving the genre as a response to this Western narrative, the so-called novel or something being translated into Arabic, and they want to stop that by going back to the roots, right? So, what's your reply to this? Was, for example, Yazji writing also within the genre, or what happened with this difference between the 18th and the 19th century of Maqamat?
It's a fantastic and central question. One way to think about it is the politics of originality. What is the political value of being perceived as original? Or what is the political value of generating something novel, like Faris al-Shidyaq is attempting to do? And why is that? Why at that particular historical point in the 1850s and 1860s does that become? Why does his subversion and iconoclasm and his desire to break apart genres become associated with something modern? Whereas al-Yazji, who is emulating, he is performing an extremely sophisticated and demanding mu'arada, which has its own established history, is suddenly seen as rote imitation as opposed to emulation. Why is it that in this moment, emulation loses its aesthetic value? It's trumped in a way by this other notion of originality or creativity. I think so. I don't have an answer. Aside from saying that, I wonder if Koselleck again is very helpful here in thinking that someone like Niqula al-Turk, whose world was not in crisis, who was not, I think, looking out at an ascendant Europe as this decidedly politically dominant force that you have, say, by the late 19th century for that 1 or 2 generations when the Nahda is also quite strong. He wasn't perceiving Adab as in need of a revival. And he wasn't postulating the classical past as something distinct that needs to be returned to. Whereas al-Yazji's whole project is to return to emulate, and perhaps to surpass that world. So perhaps Koselleck's notion that these are different conceptions of the past, and different conceptions of what the future will look like. For al-Yazji, a modern future is a future in which speakers of Arabic are able to once again master the rhetorical capacity that they had lost after, say, the fall of Baghdad, or at whatever imagined period you want. Al-Turk seems much more located in his own time, in his own moment. He's less self-conscious. And a really nice example of that, again, we didn't have time for it, is that one of the characters in one of the dirtier, more profane maqamas is al-Fakh, al-Lisan.
Is that what we skipped?
That's where we skipped. I'm so sorry. I can email it to you. Okay. It's also available. It is printed. You can read it. It's quite good. It's very funny and very dirty for those who are interested. So he has a lisp, just like the narrator in Shidyaq's Maqamat, except the way it works is so different. It is so much more contained. There's basically the Adib and the Rawi are hanging out, and this is the Maqama where the Adib has lost his fortune and he has to be teaching in this village. He's not particularly happy about teaching Nahw and Sarf and whatnot. And to make matters worse, these two boys, both of them are heavy set. One of them is terribly ugly. One of them is awfully inarticulate, and the other is quite eloquent. They come and they say, "We need your help. This guy can't speak properly. Can you fix his tongue?" And so Abu Nuwaydir, being a reputed amazing literary figure that he is, takes up the task. Apparently, this poor boy switches the zain for a ra, turning. You can begin to imagine. There's 4 different letters that he can't seem to pronounce. The ayn becomes rain. And so Abu Nuwaydir gives him first a Zainiya and then a Jimiya and so on and so forth. And each time he fails. Each time he fails. So this great figure, he fails to fix the boy's tongue. There's nothing heroic about this particular maqama. And it ends with Abu Nuwaydir chewing on the tips of his fingertips in regret. Ya'ud, what is it? Banana Nednad. Sorry about that. Whereas the Shidiyaq, and so it's such a contained moment of inarticulateness. Whereas Shidiyaq's Maqamat, which deal with this question of being unable to speak properly, it runs throughout the entire thing. It sort of overflows it in a way that we don't have with Niqula al-Turk.
Any more questions?
Can I ask one last one? What about the maqama and the rhyme prose that is not fiction? So when, for example, Shidia is writing Justice al-Qamus and this type of literature, how do you characterize that?
What does fiction mean again?
Yes.
I think the same question could be asked of Niqula al-Turk's historical works. Which, so is it something, he's talking about people's boats being hit by cannonballs and people flying through the air. And these are moments of terrible violence that turn into moments of literary presentation. Why? The part of me that's curious about psychology thinks perhaps it's a defense mechanism to fictionalize what he's actually witnessing or hearing reported, because it's quite terrible, in which case Sajjad plays a really active psychological role. But it also suggests that his historical account is partially historical, but that the understanding of the practice of history is not an objective and positivistic approach to the recording of facts. There are other aspects to it, not only differing viewpoints and opinions, like we have in al-Tabari, who records many different opinions about, say, the death of Uthman, but also different styles to convey different moments. I think a totally different approach to the same topic would look at it from the perspective of Sajjad and ask at what points is Sajjad used and why, rather than looking at it specifically through the lens of the genre of the maqama. Because the maqama here and elsewhere bleeds into so many other forms. It swallows them up and it also spits them out.
Speaking about of Sajjad, I want to thank you for rhyming the English. Of course, this is the chair of Nasif Al-Yazji, right? And I think if you were here with us, he would be happy and would approve of your use of Sajjad. Okay. Thank you again.